11 excavated skeletons of medieval kings, and the terrifying truth behind them. Did you know that one of the greatest kings of medieval England lived his entire life with a stomach crawling with roundworms, all because of dietary habits and hygiene so abysmal it was like breathing in feces every single day? This is not just some dirty little secret. When scientists opened his tomb, they were stunned to uncover a horrifying truth, not just in his battle wounds, but deep within his pelvis, where the intestines of the monarch once lay. Why could not even high nobility escape the fate of grabbing food with unwashed hands, only to end up cohabiting with thousands of parasites? And would you believe this is not the only royal death carrying a foul, unhygienic truth from the Middle Ages? If you stick around until the end of this video, you will uncover not just one, but 11 other royal remains harboring similarly terrifying secrets. From jumbled piles of bones used as playthings by common soldiers to deaths in pools of their own blood and excrement. This will absolutely shatter the way you look at medieval royal history. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell right now so you do not miss out on the most chilling and fascinating historical secrets. And let us flip through the darkest pages of human history together. Number 1. King Richard III, England. A royal meal laced with human feces. Picture the scene. It is 2012, in a perfectly ordinary public parking lot in Leicester, England. Workers and archaeologists are digging up the dull gray asphalt. Suddenly, a piece of a skull emerges. The world is left in shock. It is Richard III, the last king of the House of York, the man who vanished from the timeline after the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. But let us hold off on the glory. Look closer at those remains. Scientists took a historic cross-section right at his pelvic region. And do you know what they found? Not the residue of fine wine or roasted venison, but a dense concentration of roundworm eggs. Let me set the scene for you. In a brilliantly candlelit palace, Richard III sits on his high throne, gold rings on his fingers, but those very hands had just been touching horses, battlefield mud, and quite possibly the open-air sewage systems of the time. The concept of bacteria or soap was practically non-existent back then. Every time the king took a bite of bread or a chicken leg, he was simultaneously feeding himself thousands of parasite eggs from water contaminated with human waste. Our king, a man who could order any head chopped off, was completely powerless against the worms silently draining the nutrients from his own gut. This truth exposes a deeply ironic reality. The crown might be made of gold, but the hygiene standards of royalty back then were sometimes worse than that of an average person in the 21st century. Richard III did not just die from bone-deep slashes on the battlefield. While he lived, he was a walking host for the most repulsive creatures imaginable. Number 2. King Cnut the Great, England and Denmark, a jumbled mess of bones turned soldier's toy. Leaving Richard III's England, we travel back in time to Cnut the Great, who ruled England, Denmark, and Norway in the 11th century. He was a living legend. Yet, his remains suffered a deeply humiliating fate. In 2015, at Winchester Cathedral, experts opened the wooden chests containing royal remains for DNA testing. The scene inside looked like a cruel joke of fate. Instead of neatly laid out, intact skeletons, they found an absolute chaotic mess. The femur of this king lay next to the skull of that queen. Thousands of fragments of 6 monarchs, all jumbled together like a pile of scrap. Why such blasphemy? Let us rewind to the 17th century, right in the middle of the chaotic English Civil War. Rebellious soldiers, fueled by hatred for the monarchy and a blatant disrespect for religion, stormed the cathedral. They smashed the crypts and dragged out the bones of their ancestors. And here comes the most disgusting part. They did not just toss them aside. They used the femurs and arm bones of Cnut the Great as throwing objects. Picture drunken soldiers laughing uproariously in the cathedral halls, picking up the skull of a mighty emperor and hurling it straight at the priceless stained glass windows just to hear the crash. After the twisted game ended, those shattered, chipped bone fragments were carelessly gathered by pitiful clerics and dumped together into a single chest. Cnut the Great, the man who once commanded the tides to halt, could not even stop lowly foot soldiers from using his bones for cheap entertainment. Number 3. King Casimir IV Jagiellon, Poland. The deadly curse of the corpse mold. If the first two stories were about hygiene and humiliation, the tale of King Casimir IV of Poland plays out like a biological horror movie. In 1973, a team of 15 scientists decided to open his tomb at Wawel Cathedral after nearly 500 years of being sealed shut. As the heavy stone lid was pried open, an ancient, musty odor wafted out. At the time, they simply thought it was the smell of passing centuries. In reality, they had just opened a Pandora box. Within days, the nightmare began. One by one, the research team fell severely ill. High fevers, agonizing shortness of breath. And then, 15 people walked in. But the vast majority of them would never be able to continue their life work. They died from what the locals dubbed the curse of King Casimir. But the truth under the microscope was far more terrifying than any supernatural curse. The body of the king, decomposing in the enclosed, damp, oxygen-deprived environment of the tomb, had become the perfect breeding ground for the fungus Aspergillus flavus. Over the centuries, these fungal spores accumulated in such massive concentrations that they turned the inside of the coffin into a highly toxic biological weapon chamber. Just one accidental breath, and these spores invaded the lungs, ravaging the immune system and killing the victim from the inside out. Casimir IV did not need warriors guarding his tomb. His very own decaying body forged an invisible army, ready to annihilate any curious descendants who dared to disturb the eternal slumber of the monarch. It is a powerful testament to the fact that history does not just live in the pages of books. It lurks within pathogens capable of rising from the dead after half a millennium. If these kings have shown us the uninvited guests in the stomach of Richard III or the mold traps of Casimir, then this second part will bring you closer to the stench of rotting, quite literally. We are going to talk about monarchs who passed away in circumstances that would make even the poorest beggar shudder. Number 4. King John of England. Royal bones drowning in dysentery. King John, also known as John Lackland, the king famously tied to the Magna Carta, had a death entirely stripped of any glory of a lawmaker. In 1797, when archaeologists popped the lid off his tomb at Worcester Cathedral, they did not just find a skeleton. They found the aftermath of the most horrific digestive tragedy in royal history. Let us travel back to October 1216. King John was on a grueling march across the muddy terrains of the Wash. Desperate to soothe his hunger and exhaustion, he consumed a massive amount of fresh peaches and cider, a lethal combination for an already compromised immune system. The result? a catastrophic outbreak of dysentery erupting right inside the royal body. When excavating, scientists collected soil samples from around the pelvic and lower spine regions. Biochemical analysis revealed heavy traces of bacteria known to cause acute hemorrhagic diarrhea. This perfectly matched the accounts of clerics from that era. King John died lying in a repulsive puddle of his own making. The harsh truth is, even with a velvet cloak embroidered with gold draped over him, beneath it, the body of the king was tearing itself apart with violent intestinal spasms. And here is the cruelest irony. When the tomb was opened, his skeleton was found scattered in mud and mold. As it turns out, grave robbers from centuries past had already paid a visit. They stripped away the precious burial artifacts and tossed the remains of the king aside like a pile of trash. The monarch, who once held the fate of all England in his hands, ultimately lay bare, surrounded by the remnants of a filthy disease and the cold indifference of thieves. Number 5. Richard the Lionheart of England, the withered heart of a necrotic body. When we think of Richard I, we immediately picture a fierce warrior, the heroic Lionheart of the Crusades. But a 2012 forensic profile based on his embalmed heart, kept in Rouen, France, tells a completely different story. A tale of rotting flesh, while the man still drew breath. Richard did not die on the battlefield amidst the clash of swords. He died from a catastrophic medical error. During the siege of the castle of Chalais-Chabrol, a crossbow bolt fired by a young boy struck him squarely in the shoulder. In modern medicine, this wound would require a few stitches, but in 1199, the royal physicians brought out their crude, filthy, bacteria-ridden surgical tools. They tried to dig the arrowhead out, and in doing so, they practically injected death straight into the bloodstream of Richard. Gangrene set in rapidly. Imagine the scene inside the tent of the sovereign. The suffocating stench of rotting meat began to rise, overpowering even the heavy scent of burning frankincense. The flesh around the wound turned a dark bluish black, then purple, constantly oozing yellow pus for 12 agonizing days and nights. Richard I, a man who once terrified his enemies with a mere glance, now lay there, fully conscious, helplessly watching large chunks of his own body rot away. His heart, upon forensic analysis, showed signs of being embalmed with incredibly pungent herbs like pine resin and daisies, purely to mask that horrendous stench of decay before burial. This was not just a ceremonial honor, it was a desperate attempt by the people of his time to hide the reality that even a great king could be obliterated by an invisible microscopic organism swimming in a pus-filled wound. If the deaths of King John or Richard I were cases of painful dissolution, in this section we will witness bizarre, desperate attempts to force eternity. Number 6. Emperor Charlemagne, the shriveled corpse on the throne. This is one of the most haunting scenes ever recorded in medieval chronicles. In the year 1000, Emperor Otto III decided to open the tomb of his great predecessor, Charlemagne, at Aachen. What he saw was not a coffin resting horizontally, but an intensely eerie presence. Historian Thietmar of Merseburg described that when the crypt doors were thrust open, the flickering torchlight illuminated a figure sitting bolt upright on a marble throne. It was Charlemagne. He was not lying down like ordinary dead men. For nearly 200 years, the corpse of this emperor had been sitting there, a crown upon his head, his withered hands still gripping a gospel book. Time and the unique atmospheric conditions inside the crypt had turned his body into a shriveled mummy. The flesh clung tightly to the bone, like old leather. Imagine the breathtaking contrast. On one side, the absolute symbol of power of a vast empire, and on the other, the crumbling, dry reality of a biological entity drained of life. Charlemagne had ruled in the darkness of his tomb like a phantom on a throne for centuries. It was not until 1165 that Frederick Barbarossa opened the tomb again, ending this horror show by transferring his remains into a new coffin to be canonized. But the image of the seated king remains one of the most macabre symbols of the ambition of humanity to conquer death. Number 7. King Edward I, Longshanks of England, the wax-wrapped body exposed. Edward I is known as a brutal king, the man who crushed Scotland, as famously depicted in the movie Braveheart. But that ruthlessness seemingly extended to how he prepared for his own corpse. When the Society of Antiquaries of London opened his marble tomb at Westminster Abbey in 1774, they came face to face with a bizarre, wax-encased masterpiece. Instead of turning to dust after nearly 500 years, the body of Edward I still retained its facial features and hands. The secret lay in a deeply obsessive embalming ritual. His body was tightly wrapped in countless layers of thick, beeswax-soaked linen, creating an airtight cocoon. Hot wax had been poured directly over the layers to completely block out any air. When Sir Joseph Alof lifted the lid, he saw the king lying there, as still as if sleeping inside an artificial shell. This was the pinnacle of royal obsession. They refused to accept natural decay. They wanted to turn their bodies into eternal wax figures. But the terrifying truth is that beneath that smooth wax exterior, it was really just a corpse, waiting to be scrutinized by future generations. Edward I, the man who sowed terror among the Scots, ultimately ended up as a display piece in the laboratory of an archaeologist. Number 8. King Denis of Portugal. A throne could not save rotting teeth. In 2022, an excavation at the monastery of Odivelas unveiled the agonizing life of King Denis I, one of the greatest monarchs of Portugal. But when archaeologists looked at his skull, they did not see greatness. They saw prolonged medical torture. Imagine this. This king was so wealthy he could build an entire university, yet he could not get a proper toothbrush. Forensic analysis showed the jawbone of Denis I had been ravaged by deep gaping holes, the grim aftermath of severe gum abscesses and festering tooth pulp. In the final years of his life, every time King Denis smiled or spoke, his breath likely carried the distinct smell of decomposition. The horrific reality is, without antibiotics or modern dentistry, this king was forced to live with permanent pools of pus inside his mouth. Every time he swallowed food, he swallowed the blood and pus leaking from his gums. The trigeminal nerve pain shooting up into his brain must have turned royal banquets into torture sessions. His remains are undeniable proof that even if you held an entire kingdom in your hands, if you lived in the 14th century, you still had to surrender to a rotting tooth. Number 9. King Robert the Bruce of Scotland. A medical mystery spun on a skull. Robert the Bruce is the soul of Scottish independence, but his remains fell victim to vicious rumors for centuries. When his bones were accidentally discovered in 1818, people noticed that the bone around his nasal area was severely eroded. Immediately, his detractors and even historians of the time spun a gruesome narrative. This national hero was supposedly afflicted with leprosy, the most cursed disease of the Middle Ages, or end-stage syphilis that caused his nose to rot and fall off. They wanted to twist his majestic image into a festering, repulsive corpse. However, a 3D forensic examination by the University of Western Ontario in 2017 exposed the truth. There were absolutely no characteristic signs of leprosy bacteria on the skull. The erosion was, in fact, caused by natural weathering from the soil and mold inside the damp tomb over nearly 700 years. The story of the remains of Robert the Bruce teaches us a vital lesson. Sometimes, the truth about death is far more horribly distorted than death itself, purely to serve political agendas and the cheap curiosity of future generations. Number 10. King Louis IX of France, a boiled skeleton and necrotic teeth. Saint Louis IX of France is the only French monarch to be canonized, yet the journey to bring his remains back to his homeland plays out like a scene straight out of a slasher film. In 1270, he died of dysentery in Tunisia during a crusade. Amidst the suffocating heat of North Africa, if they had left the corpse intact for the voyage back to France, it would have rotted and liquefied within days. The solution of the era? A technique known as mos teutonicus, the Germanic custom of boiling corpses. Picture this horrifying spectacle. Doctors and priests chopped the body of the beloved king into pieces, then tossed them into massive copper pots filled with water mixed with strong wine. They boiled the parts vigorously for hours until the necrotic flesh completely separated from the bones. The flesh was buried locally, while the stark white skeleton was collected to be taken back to Paris. A 2019 forensic analysis of his remaining jawbone revealed yet another painful secret. Louis IX suffered from severe scurvy. Because his military diet consisted solely of dried meat and hardtack, his gums had rotted, bleeding incessantly. And his teeth were falling out long before he succumbed to disease. It turns out that behind the halo of a saint was a body utterly tortured by malnutrition and a corpse processing procedure that could not possibly be more brutal. Number 11. Pope Formosus, Papal States, the trial of a rotting corpse. We conclude this journey with an event so utterly insane that no screenwriter could ever invent it. The Cadaver Synod of 897. Pope Formosus had been dead and buried for 7 months, but his bitter enemy, Pope Stephen VI, refused to let him rest in peace. Stephen VI ordered the corpse of Formosus to be dug up. By this time, the body was in an advanced stage of decomposition, oozing fluids and emitting a nauseating stench. They dressed that rotting corpse in magnificent pontifical robes embroidered with gold, placed the papal tiara on its skull, and strapped it tightly to a throne to stand trial. Picture the setting of this courtroom. On one side, cardinals in brilliant red robes. On the other, a corpse literally falling apart on a throne. Every time Stephen VI screamed an interrogation at the defendant, a young priest hiding behind the throne would fake the voice of the dead man to answer. After being found guilty, the corpse was stripped of its clothes, the 3 fingers used for blessings were violently hacked off, and it was dragged through the muddy streets of Rome before being hurled into the Tiber River. This is the absolute zenith of medieval madness, where the line between life and death, between sanctity and revulsion, was completely and utterly obliterated. After walking through 11 crypts, witnessing the most powerful monarchs in history being boiled in wine, hollowed out by tapeworms, or put on trial as oozing corpses, perhaps we should pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what do power and fame truly mean in the face of the cruelty of time? In life, these kings commanded tens of thousands of troops, hoarded vaults overflowing with gold, and wore blindingly magnificent crowns. They once believed they were the embodiment of the divine, that they were immortal. But when the coffin lid shuts, the laws of nature spare no one. Bacteria hold no respect for a scepter. Mold does not back down from gold-embroidered robes. And decay certainly does not distinguish between royal blood and the blood of a commoner. It reminds us that no matter who you are, what peak of your career you stand on, or how much wealth you possess, the ultimate destination of the flesh is just dust. The only thing that truly survives for posterity is not a body encased in beeswax or bones kept in a lead box, but our values, our legacies, and how we treated our fellow human beings while we still drew breath. Looking at kings who suffered excruciating pain from dental abscesses or dysentery, we realize just how incredibly lucky we are to live in an era of advanced medicine. Cherish your health and those simple joys that even the wealthiest men of the 12th century could not buy with an entire kingdom. History is not just about numbers or battles. History is a mirror. Those silent bones are whispering to us. Live a life worthy, because when the velvet curtain falls and the crown slips away, all that remains is the naked truth of a human life. 11 remains, 11 stories, and thousands of agonies have been laid bare, from kings tortured by roundworms to those boiled alive or dragged to court as rotting flesh. History is not always as radiant and glorious as it appears in the movies. It is saturated with the stench of death, bacteria, and the raw, unvarnished truths of the human condition. Death spares no one, and it bows to the crown of no one. These bones are not just lifeless pieces of calcium. They are living witnesses to an era where the boundary between absolute nobility and utter filth was thinner than ever. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey into medieval crypts. If you found these truths fascinating, do not forget to leave a comment. Which story about which king haunted you the most? Hit the like button and share this video if you want to see more historical mysteries decoded in this gripping style. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel right now so we can dive deeper into the unsolved mysteries of humanity together. See you in the next mystery video. Goodbye.